I first learned about vernacular, that I first heard the phrase vernacular economy in Alistair McIntosh's Soil and Soul. And he, as someone of, my father's generation, coming from the Outer Hebrides, not that far from where some of my ancestors came from, was describing the lived experience of this in his childhood. And likewise, John Moriarty, who died not that many years ago, describes, growing up in the first half of the 20th century in a village in Ireland. And he says, if everyone over the age of 14 had just disappeared overnight, all of us at 14 could have done all of what was required to feed ourselves, to run the village, to look after each other, to meet each other's needs. And none of this knowledge was recognized by the schooling systems that were determining whether we knew anything.
Right. Absolutely.
And that's, that's part of the very ground level, practical, material end of the spectrum of the epistemological injustice that you're talking about, and that that Vanessa speaks about in Hospicing Modernity as well. But it runs all of the way through. It's we have to bring different knowledges back to the table. This is what I'm finding myself in dialogue with people about and writing about now on the far side of this book, is a really sharp recognition that there have been kinds of knowledge and kinds of experience that have not been welcome at the tables of modernity, things that you don't talk about if you want to be invited back. And that, in the fracturing, in the dying of modernity, in the ending of the world as we have known it, which climate change is a big and important part of, but not the whole part of by any means, in that it becomes imperative that these other things are brought to the table, and that we find ways of insisting on them being made welcome at the table. And on the one hand, that includes like the knowledge of all of the shades of shit that were the shadow side of modernity all along, that you're not meant to talk about if you want to be taken seriously. And on the other hand, the miraculous, the patterns of meaning that run through reality, which you're not meant to take seriously if you want to be taken seriously. And in a sense, so long as it was working well, the structures of modern society didn't leave many cracks through which those patterns of meaning, those experiences of the miraculous nature of the kind of world that we're actually in, could come. And that made it easier to enforce the sort of the insistence on them not being, like, that kind of knowledge not being welcome at the table. But as the fractures widen and become more obvious, so we get more glimpses of these strange patterns of things that oughtn't to be possible according to the logics of the world that is ending, coming through. And if only out of desperation, people find themselves falling back on that, both on what they learn from encounters with people from other cultures, and also falling back on, remnants within our own cultures of other ways of knowing and being in and dwelling in the world. And as we fall back on them, as we're thrown back on them, we find that there is more substance there than was allowed to be possible, according to the accounts of reality, the ways of seeing and ways of knowing the world that were regarded as grown up within modernity. And none of this is going to present us with any sort of deus ex machina that's going to rescue us from the trouble that we're in. But learning how to bring both of those things back to the table, in some ways we have to allow the miraculous, the beautiful, the magical, and the marvelous back to the table in order to allow the shit to the table as well, because otherwise we will just be paralyzed.
Right, exactly.
As we begin to recognize just how deep the shit is.
Yes.
But actually it's happening. And I see this in really strange and unexpected places in ways that would be hard to foresee even 5 years ago. And I think, I'm thinking of some of the conversations I've had with people at the core of XR in recent times, and the ways in which I see them being influenced by their dialogues with theologians. And I heard Claire Farrell from XR talking about, there's always been this language of beyond hope, which has been one of the kind of powerful and challenging things within XR.
Yes.
And talking about being surprised to find herself using language of faith, and faith being part of what might be found beyond.
It's fascinating, yes.
So these are the strange waters that I think we're being invited into. And I think as we're invited into them, it's important to be challenged in the way that you've been bringing to this conversation of, does this risk being a privileged space of safety to retreat into talking about any of this? But I also remember something that John Berger, who the great Marxist intellectual, who is one of the major influences on my life, I remember him saying nihilism is a position of privilege. The poor cannot afford to treat the world as if it is this domain of meaninglessness. That's something that you only ever find amongst people who are being cushioned on a great deal of privilege. And so in the way that you describe encountering in India, like what actually goes on in any vernacular culture, what actually goes on as people are finding ways to survive and make life worth living under hard conditions, it's always a dance between the material and the metaphysical, between the concrete, the messy, the shit, and the patterns of meaning, the elements of ritual in the other sense, to that hollowed out sense that we've spoken about it earlier in this conversation, through which we make life worth living.